I just had that left over. I must admit, Bing, that you took California by storm.
Oh, I don't know about it. When the storm cleared up, though, you bought all the property.
In 1947, Bob Hope and Bing Crosby seemed like Hollywood's perfect duo, but behind their famous road movies lay a bitter truth. Crosby called him a talentless hack, refused to attend his roasts, and wouldn't let their wives socialize. Now, decades later, the real story emerges of how two comedy legends went from partners to enemies, and the shocking betrayal that finally tore them apart. Bob Hope was born as Leslie Towns Hope on May 29, 1903. In a London suburb called Eltham. His father, William, was a stonemason from Somerset. His mother, Avis, was a light opera singer from Wales. Money was tight, and life in England was not easy. William decided to take a chance on a better future. In 1907, he left for America and settled in Cleveland, Ohio, where his brothers were already working as plumbers and steam fitters. A year later, he sent for his wife and 6 sons. The family traveled in third class aboard the SS Philadelphia and arrived at Ellis Island on March 30th, 1908. When immigration officers recorded their information, they mistakenly listed Bob as 2 years old instead of 4. That error stayed with him on official documents for years. Life in Cleveland was difficult. The Hope family lived in a small home near Doan's Corners and struggled to make ends meet. They often took in boarders for extra income. Avis, despite the hardships, never stopped encouraging her children. She taught Bob to sing and helped him develop his natural ability to entertain. He loved to mimic people, tell jokes, and perform little dance routines. Even when money was scarce, his mother made sure he had a chance to grow his talents. Bob's first real taste of performing came when he was 10. He entered a Charlie Chaplin look-alike contest at Luna Park in Cleveland and won. He loved the excitement of being on stage, but at that time, entertainment wasn't his main focus. Instead, he became interested in boxing. In 1919, he competed in the Ohio Novice Boxing Championships under the name Packy East, a tribute to boxer Packy McFarland. He won 3 fights before losing in the finals. Later in life, he joked that he spent more time on the canvas than Picasso. To help support his family, Bob took whatever jobs he could find. He sold newspapers, worked as a soda jerk, sold shoes, and even tried hustling pool. These jobs put him in contact with all kinds of people. He paid attention to how they talked, how they moved, and what made them laugh. Without realizing it, he was gathering the material that would later shape his comedy. By the 1920s, he started taking entertainment more seriously. He took dance lessons from professionals like King Rastus Brown and Johnny Root, which helped him get small jobs in vaudeville. His first performing partner was Mildred Rosequist, but her mother wouldn't allow her to travel, so he teamed up with Lloyd Durbin and later George Byrne. In the beginning, he performed in small venues like Cleveland's Bandbox Theater. He kept working, improving, and climbing his way up. By 1931, he had reached New York City's Palace Theater, one of the biggest vaudeville stages in the country. Vaudeville became Bob's training ground. Most comedians of the time stuck to prepared routines, but he developed a more natural style. He liked to interact with the audience rather than just deliver rehearsed jokes. His performances combined dancing with quick one-liners, a mix that set him apart from other entertainers. By the late 1930s, he made the leap from vaudeville to radio. His first radio appearances included hosting The Intimate Review in 1935 and The Atlantic Family from 1935 to 1936. These early shows helped him get noticed, but it was The Pepsodent Show starring Bob Hope that made him a national star. When The Pepsodent Show started airing on NBC, it became an instant hit. In the early 1940s, it was the #1 show in America. Even as time passed, it stayed in the top 5 for more than 10 years. Every week, millions of listeners tuned in, waiting to hear what Hope would say next. His style was different from other comedians at the time. Most radio stars played fictional characters, but Hope made himself the punchline. He joked about real events and everyday life, keeping his material fresh. He told his writers to read the newspaper and turn headlines into jokes. They wrote hundreds of jokes every week, and Hope picked only the best. This fast-paced approach set the stage for the late-night talk show monologues that would come decades later. His success didn't go unnoticed. He won 3 Peabody Awards, one of the highest honors in broadcasting. The first came in 1944, recognizing his efforts to boost morale during the war. The Peabody Committee praised his dedication, saying the joy he brought to the troops could never be measured. Later, he received more Peabody Awards for his work in both radio and television. At its peak, The Pepsodent Show wasn't just the most popular popular radio show, it was part of American culture. From 1942 to 1944, it held the top spot, proving that comedy could be more than just entertainment. It could bring people together. It could lift spirits in hard times. Even after radio faded, Hope's influence never disappeared. In 1990, he was inducted into the Radio Hall of Fame, a final honor for a man who had spent decades shaping the world of comedy. Bob Hope's start in Hollywood was anything but glamorous. His first film role came in 1934 with Going Spanish, a short film that he later joked was so bad it should be used as punishment. That kind of humor became his trademark, sharp, self-aware, and always delivered with perfect timing. He didn't take himself too seriously, but audiences loved him for it. His big break came in The Big Broadcast of 1938. It wasn't just another musical comedy. It gave the world Thanks for the Memory. Hope sang the song with Shirley Ross, and it became an instant hit. The lyrics were sentimental and witty, and the melody was unforgettable. More than just a song, it became part of his identity. It captured everything people loved about him: charm, humor, and a touch of sincerity. By the late 1930s, Hope was already a major star on radio, but Hollywood was a different challenge. His film roles played on his natural comedic style. He was always the fast-talking, overconfident guy who found himself in trouble. The Cat and the Canary, 1939, was a perfect example. It was a mix of horror and comedy, with Hope playing a nervous hero trapped in a haunted house. The balance of suspense and humor worked, and audiences couldn't get enough of him. Then came Road to Singapore, 1940. This was the start of something legendary. It was the first of the Road to Films, a series that paired Hope with Bing Crosby and Dorothy Lamour. These movies had everything: music, adventure, and non-stop comedy. Hope and Crosby had incredible chemistry. Crosby was the smooth talker. Hope was the wisecracking coward. And Lamour was the woman they both chased after. What made these films special was how natural they felt. Much of the humor wasn't in the script. Hope and Crosby improvised constantly, throwing jokes at each other and even breaking the fourth wall. Their quick banter gave the movies an energy that audiences loved. The series ran for over 2 decades, with Road to Morocco, 1942, becoming one of the most popular entries. The formula was simple, but it never got old. Hope and Crosby weren't just acting, they were having fun, and it showed. Even outside the Road to series, Hope proved he could carry a film on his own. He had a gift for parody, taking classic genres and turning them into hilarious comedies. The Paleface, 1948, was a perfect example. He played a cowardly dentist who accidentally became a Western hero. The idea of Hope as a gunslinger was ridiculous, but that's what made it so funny. He didn't play tough guys. He played the guy who got in over his head and somehow survived. His love for parody continued with My Favorite Brunette, 1947, a comedy that poked fun at detective films. The Ghostbreakers, 1940, mixed horror and comedy, with Hope trying to survive a night in a haunted mansion. He wasn't a traditional action star. He didn't fight his way out of trouble. He talked his way out. That made him different from other leading men at the time. Bob Hope's first USO tour on May 6, 1941, was the start of something historic. That night at March Field in California, he performed his NBC radio show live for an audience of servicemen. It was a new experience for him and a big moment for the USO, which had been founded just months earlier. Soldiers filled the venue, eager to see a Hollywood star perform just for them. Hope gave them a mix of comedy and music, but more than that, he gave them a reason to laugh. His jokes were sharp, quick, and made just for them. He talked about their daily lives, their struggles, and the strange world of military bases. It wasn't a polished theater performance. It felt personal. The soldiers responded with roaring laughter, and in that moment, Hope knew he had found his most important audience. That show changed everything. Over the next year and a half, Hope traveled across the U.S., performing at bases and camps. Then came World War II, and he took his act overseas. From 1941 to 1945, he toured some of the most dangerous places in the world. He performed in Europe and the Pacific, often near active combat zones. His 1944 tour of the South Pacific covered 30,000 miles in 2 months. He visited Hawaii, New Guinea, and Australia, performing more than 150 shows. Some places had barely any infrastructure. Stages were makeshift, and the equipment was unreliable. He didn't care. The soldiers were what mattered. Hope's tours were risky. German forces tracked his movements, knowing how much he meant to American morale. Towns where he had just performed were bombed soon after. He never never let the danger stop him. Instead, he turned it into part of his act. If a bomb dropped nearby, he joked about it. If the conditions were rough, he made fun of himself for being there. Soldiers loved him for that. His performances weren't just about laughter. They reminded troops of home. He brought singers, musicians, and dancers to make the shows feel special. Every performance was different. He tailored his jokes to fit the place, the people, and the situation. He wasn't just entertaining soldiers. He was connecting with them. Over time, Hope became more than a comedian. He became a symbol of support. Soldiers saw him as one of them, someone who understood what they were going through. His Christmas tours were especially important. During the Korean War, he performed in freezing conditions, sometimes just miles from battle zones. In Vietnam, where public opinion on the war was divided, he faced criticism back home, but never stopped showing up for the troops. His Vietnam tours were some of his biggest. He brought Hollywood stars like Anne Margaret and Raquel Welch to perform alongside him. The shows were carefully planned to avoid attacks, with stages set up in different locations to confuse enemies. For the soldiers, these performances were unforgettable. Many had never seen a live show before, let alone one with celebrities from home. Hope's dedication never faded. In 1990, at 87 years old, he traveled to Saudi Arabia during Operation Desert Shield. He had been performing for troops for nearly 5 decades, covering 57 USO tours across multiple wars and continents. In 1997, Congress named him an honorary veteran. It was the one title he valued more than any award or trophy. Bob Hope stepped into television in 1947 when he hosted the first commercial broadcast on Los Angeles' KTLA. But his real breakthrough came on April 9, 1950, with NBC's Star-Spangled Review. This variety show brought his sharp monologues, comedy sketches, and musical performances to TV. It was a natural transition from radio, where he had already built a loyal audience. The show aired live from New York and marked the beginning of his long partnership with NBC. Instead of committing to a weekly series, Hope chose to focus on television specials. This decision gave him the flexibility to maintain high-quality productions while continuing his work in films and USO tours. His early success on television set him apart. In 1950, he signed a long-term contract with NBC, ensuring he would stay on the air for decades. Many entertainers from radio struggled with the shift to television, but Hope's timing and delivery worked just as well on screen as they had on the air. By the early 1950s, he was one of the most recognizable faces in entertainment. His Christmas specials became a lasting tradition. He had started performing for U.S. troops during World War II, but in 1954, he began filming these performances for television. These specials showed him traveling around the world to entertain soldiers, often bringing major stars like Anne Margaret, Raquel Welch, and Neil Armstrong. They weren't just holiday broadcasts, they were moments of connection for troops far from home. One of the most memorable aired in January 1970. This was his Vietnam Christmas show, which drew 64% of the television audience, the highest ever for an entertainment special at the time. For soldiers in the middle of a controversial war, Hope's visits were more than just entertainment. They were a reminder of home. His Christmas specials continued for decades, with his last overseas USO tour happening during Operation Desert Shield in 1990. These shows defined his legacy as more than a comedian. He was someone who used his talent to lift the spirits of those serving their country. Hope's television specials followed a format that would later influence variety shows and late-night talk shows. His opening monologues covered current events with quick, sharp humor. He filled each special with celebrity guests, music, and comedy skits. His style of humor made him relatable, even when he was sharing the stage with Hollywood's biggest stars. From 1963 to 1967, he also hosted Bob Hope Presents the Chrysler Theater, an anthology series that featured dramatic plays and variety-style episodes. This showed his range as both a performer and producer. Between 1950 and 1996, he hosted more than 300 television specials, leaving behind a legacy that shaped American entertainment. Meanwhile, Bob Hope's love life was filled with contradictions. His first marriage to Grace Louise Troxell remains a mystery. They got married on January 25, 1933, in Erie, Pennsylvania, while performing together in vaudeville. By November 1934, the marriage was over. What makes this unusual is that Hope later denied it ever happened. Publicists even claimed the marriage license was a mistake, though court records proved otherwise. Despite this denial, Hope quietly privately sent Troxell money for the rest of her life. She died in 1976 at the age of 65, still financially supported by the man who claimed she was never his wife. This story gets even stranger when you look at the timing. In mid-1933, while still legally married to Troxell, Hope began an affair with Dolores Reed. She was a Ziegfeld performer who had just joined his vaudeville troupe. Hope later claimed he married Reed in February 1934, but that was months before his divorce from Troxell was finalized. This raises a serious question. Was Hope a bigamist, or did he simply make up details about his second marriage? No marriage certificate or wedding photos of Hope and Reed have ever been found. Biographers like Richard Zoglin have questioned whether their marriage was ever legally recognized. If it wasn't, Reed never seemed to care. She once said that if their marriage hadn't been a good one, she wouldn't have stayed. Whatever the truth, Hope and Reed remained together for nearly 70 years, until his death in 2003. The couple built a family by adopting 4 children, Linda, Anthony, Kelly, and Eleonora, from an orphanage in Evanston, Illinois. They also became legal guardians of Tracy Shore, the daughter of famous New York bar owner Bernard Toots Shore. Despite Hope's long absences and well-known affairs, the family maintained a close public image. Reed focused on raising the children, while Hope built his career as one of America's most famous entertainers. Hope presented himself as a devoted husband and a faithful Catholic, but his private life told a different story. Hope had countless affairs with young actresses and showgirls. Some were short-lived, others lasted for years. His charm and power kept these stories hidden, but one affair nearly exposed him in a way he couldn't control. In 1949, Hope met Barbara Payton, a rising star in Hollywood. She was young, beautiful, and ambitious. Hope was married, but that didn't stop him from pursuing her. He set her up in an expensive apartment and lavished her with gifts. For 6 months, they carried on a secret affair, but Payton wanted more. She pushed for financial support and a deeper commitment. Hope, known for being careful with money, refused. By August, he ended things. To keep her quiet, he gave her a payout and walked away. For years, their affair remained a secret. Hope continued his pattern, moving on to other women. His team worked hard to control his image. Any rumors were quickly shut down. But in 1956, Payton broke the silence. Her career had collapsed. She was struggling with money and personal troubles. Desperate, she sold her story to Confidential magazine. In the interview, she exposed Hope in a way no one else had. She described him as cold, controlling, and ruthless. She revealed details about their affair that shattered his wholesome image. Hope's response was silence. He knew that engaging with the scandal would only make it worse. His PR team stepped in and managed the damage. The story faded, and Hope's career remained intact. Payton wasn't so lucky. Speaking out against a powerful man in Hollywood had consequences. Her career never recovered. She sank deeper into poverty and addiction. By the time she died in 1967, she had become a forgotten name. Hope, on the other hand, continued his double life. His long-term affair with actress Marilyn Maxwell was an open secret in Hollywood, but the public never found out. Another relationship with Miss World winner Rosemary Franklin lasted nearly 30 years. Insiders spoke of young women waiting outside his hotel rooms during tours. Some were hopeful actresses. Others were models and beauty queens. Hope enjoyed the attention, but never let these affairs interfere with his career. Reed knew about his infidelities, but she accepted them. In a 1978 interview, she admitted she doubted her husband was ever 100% true blue. Yet, she chose to stay. Maybe it was her Catholic faith. Maybe it was a practical decision. Whatever the reason, she remained by his side. And despite all the affairs, no one else ever took her place. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby were never meant to be a team. When Paramount started casting Road to Singapore, the script was passed over by 5 other duos. Fred McMurray and Jack Oakey turned it down. So did George Burns and Gracie Allen. The studio was running out of options. Hope was a rising comic, fresh off The Cat and the Canary, but he wasn't a movie star yet. Crosby was. Paramount decided to take a chance and pair them up. Hope and Crosby had met before on radio and in live performances, but they weren't close. The studio wasn't even sure they would work well together. To be safe, they cast Dorothy Lamour as the female lead. Crosby was the big name, so Hope was billed third. Filming started in October 1939, and the two actors quickly found a rhythm. They began improvising, throwing in jokes, breaking the fourth wall. Nearly half the film's dialogue wasn't in the original script. The director, Victor Schertzinger, was annoyed, but the audience loved it. The film was a hit. Hope and Crosby had stumbled into something that worked, and Paramount saw potential potential for more. They went on to make 6 more road movies together, but their relationship wasn't what it seemed on screen. In private, Crosby didn't think much of Hope. He called him a talentless hack more than once. He wasn't joking. Crosby was reserved and preferred his own company. Hope was the opposite. He thrived in social settings and liked to be surrounded by people. On set, Crosby kept to himself, reading race results or sitting alone while Hope mingled with the crew. They didn't spend time together outside of work. Even their wives never socialized. Their differences showed in other ways too. When Hope was honored at a Friars Club roast, Crosby didn't show up. He was a board member of the club, so people noticed. When asked why he skipped it, he shrugged it off. I wasn't hungry. Money was another issue. Crosby was the bigger star at first, so he earned nearly twice what Hope made on the first road films. Hope didn't like that. By 1947, he renegotiated his contract and started making the same as Crosby. But the competition between them never really ended. Bob Hope and Bing Crosby's rivalry wasn't just for the cameras. It was part of their act, a constant back and forth that made their films even funnier. In Road to Bali, 1952, Hope turned to the audience and said, "He's gonna sing, folks. Now's the time to go out for popcorn." During interviews and public appearances, they kept up the act. Hope once said, "There's nothing I wouldn't do for Bing, and there's nothing he wouldn't do for me. And that's how we go through life, doing nothing for each other." Their humor masked any real tension, making them seem like an inseparable duo. In reality, they were never close, but the public saw them as two sides of the same coin, always competing, always entertaining. At 94, Bob Hope attended the funeral of his old friend Jimmy Stewart. People noticed how frail he looked. A year later, he stepped onto the stage at the 50th anniversary of the Primetime Emmy Awards. Milton Berle and Sid Caesar joined him. Hollywood legends Fay Wray and Gloria Stewart were also in the audience. Even in his final years, Hope stayed connected to the world that made him famous. In 1999, he attended the opening of the Bob Hope Gallery of American Entertainment at the Library of Congress. The institution honored him with 2 major exhibitions about his life and career. The following year, at 97, he made one of his last public appearances at the Hope Classic Golf Tournament. There, he hugged Swedish golfer Jesper Parnevik. By then, his health was declining. A year later, he was hospitalized for pneumonia. Despite his age, Hope reached a milestone that few ever do. On May 29, 2003, he celebrated his 100th birthday. The city of Los Angeles renamed the intersection of Hollywood and Vine as Bob Hope Square. 35 states declared it Bob Hope Day. Even then, his sense of humor remained sharp. He joked, "I'm so old, they've canceled my blood type." Hope had always kept his faith private. But 7 years before his death, he converted to Catholicism. He also had an odd brush with his own mortality. In 1998, 5 years before he passed, an obituary written by the Associated Press was released by mistake. The U.S. House of Representatives even announced his death before realizing he was still alive. Though he became frail in his final years, he remained in relatively good health for most of his old age. On the morning of July 27, 2003, Bob Hope passed away at his home in Toluca Lake, California. He was 2 months past his 100th birthday. His grandson later shared that, on his deathbed, Hope's wife Dolores asked where he wanted to be buried. He simply replied, "Surprise me." His remains were placed in a mausoleum vault at San Fernando Mission Cemetery. Later, they were moved to the Bob Hope Memorial Garden, built next to the cemetery. Dolores lived another 8 years, passing away at 102. After his death, cartoonists around the world paid tribute. Many drew his longtime friend, Bing Crosby, who had died in 1977, welcoming him to heaven. It was a perfect send-off for a man who had spent his life making people laugh.